wanted to really celebrate the independence of black folks even under enslavement. And one of the ways we thought to do that today was through through celebrating the Negro courts of the 18th century, which was in New England towns. And for our panel today, we're looking at one of our experts who will be setting us straight on that, and that's Ray Rickman. I'll read his biographies real quick of our panelists before we get started. Ray Rickman is a businessman and president of the Rickman Group, a consulting firm that raises money and conducts management and diversity training for nonprofits and small and large businesses. He's an avid historian. He's also the executive director of Stages of Freedom, a nonprofit that provides African American culture programs and free swimming lessons to hundreds of youths of color. He's a former state rep from Providence and has served as Rhode Island deputy secretary, putting them together, of the state. With us also is Lawrence Greenwald. She's a staff attorney at New Hampshire's legal assistant, specializing in housing law, including discrimination under the Fair Housing Act. Prior to that, her position, she worked for 15 years as a criminal defense attorney with the New Hampshire Public Defender, and as a private defense attorney at Samperfield and Welsh in Exeter. Attorney Greenwald began her legal career as a judicial clerk in the Office of the Prosecution at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavian government. And also with us is our young activist, Jordan Thompson. He's a writer, a young activist, a community organizer from Nashua. In 2017, he ran a youth-powered campaign for moderator in Nashua Ward 2. He ran for the New Hampshire House of Representatives in 2018, narrowly losing the primary by 30 votes. Wow. Today, he's focused his efforts on child welfare advocacy and empowering others through cultural awareness and civic engagement. In February 2018, he was one of 10 young men of color selected to participate in My Brother's Keepers Conference of Young Leaders that was started by President Barack Obama. So we look forward to a conversation today with our panelists that will not only connect our past, the 18th century courts, but we'll also look at issues that are in our court system today. So without much anything else, I'll pass it over to our panelists. To give you an idea of the format, each panelist will speak on their point for about 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up to the floor for a discussion. And I'm hopeful that we can create a real dialogue, and that we just are respectful, we not be afraid to talk about what we want, ask the questions, but really engage in a dialogue on the conversation, because without that, we can't move change. You're going to start?
Good morning, everyone. As Jerry Ann very nicely introduced me, I'm Lauren Greenwald, and I'm first going to just, can you hear me okay?
No.
Yes.
There.
Better?
Yes.
Nod on?
Yes.
Okay.
Just have to hold it up.
Okay.
Like I screamed
So, as Jerry Ann mentioned, I work presently for New Hampshire Legal Assistance. New Hampshire Legal Assistance mission is to provide equal access to justice for New Hampshire's poor, essentially. My primary responsibilities there is I'm a staff attorney. I represent people who are facing housing issues, which could be in the form of evictions, or it could be in the form of housing discrimination. New Hampshire Legal Assistance has a broad practice, and we also represent people who are dealing with public benefits issues, We help people who are victims of domestic violence who are seeking protective orders from the court, and we also help them with extended representation in divorce. We help New Hampshire teens and children who are facing long-term suspensions or expulsions in the schools and advocate for their educational rights, their healthcare rights, etc., to help make them more successful in their communities and remain home-based rather than being placed somewhere. And then we help people we help seniors in various aspects of life. We do public benefits work. We have clients who are victims of being exploited as seniors. We do health insurance work. One of the pieces of work that I wanted to explain to you today was New Hampshire Legal Assistance has recently filed a class action against the Trump administration that relates to the new Medicaid work requirements that are being implemented right now. We are following the states of Arkansas and Tennessee who have already filed class actions against the Trump administration. And let me just start, I'm sure many of you know, but Medicaid is a state health insurance program that benefits low-income adults, children, pregnant women, disabled adults, but the primary beneficiaries of Medicaid are working families. This is a program that's administered by each of the states, but it's controlled by the federal government. The federal government sets the rules for Medicaid. One of the recent rules that the Trump administration implemented is that anyone who's receiving Medicaid has to demonstrate that they are working 100 hours per month or that they're doing community service 100 hours per month. These work requirements are irrationally connected to the Medicaid benefits. And they're also not only that, but they are extremely burdensome to the insured to demonstrate. So the class action seeks to overturn that requirement. In Arkansas and in Tennessee, these rules have already been rolled out, and in Arkansas, 18,000 residents have already lost coverage. So we're concerned about that in New Hampshire, and the rollout of that rule is starting this month, and by August, the people will be losing coverage who have not been able to comply with those requirements. There are exemptions for people who are unable to work, but that also is a burdensome requirement for individuals, and it's something that has to be demonstrated on a monthly basis. It's also extremely burdensome for healthcare providers to jump through all these hoops just to provide healthcare to people. So New Hampshire Legal Assistance has filed a class action with 4 brave Medicaid recipients who are the plaintiffs. They are the people who are representing the class. And this case is pending in the federal district court in Washington, D.C., because it's a suit against the federal government. And the fortunate thing about the process of these cases is that the judge who's in charge of all 3, Arkansas, Tennessee, and New Hampshire, has already issued a favorable ruling in the Arkansas and Tennessee cases. So New Hampshire's case is following right along. It's in a slower stage, but Arkansas and Tennessee had already implemented those rules. That's why they're ahead of us. But we have some good activity in that case, so we are hopeful at least, and we will continue to fight on that front. So there are lots of things I could talk about New Hampshire legal assistance, but I actually thought it would be relevant in my very brief remaining time to talk about a very recent event in the New Hampshire legislature, and that is that the New Hampshire legislature this year repealed New Hampshire's death penalty. And so let me just clarify that NHLA had nothing to do with that activity. We actually only do civil work. We don't do any criminal work. I personally was a criminal defense lawyer for 15 years, or a public defender for 15 years, and then I was in private practice after that. But the reason I wanted to mention the repeal of the death penalty today is that, this is the year that the repeal was enacted, the governor vetoed it, and the legislature had enough votes to override the governor's veto. It takes a simple majority to pass a law, but it takes 2/3 of the House and Senate in the legislature to override a governor's veto. And this year there were enough votes to do that. So that's why it was a big event in New Hampshire death penalty history. New Hampshire hasn't executed anyone since 1939. So it's not that New Hampshire was utilizing the death penalty routinely. Sorry?
No, I'm just trying.
Okay, no problem. There is someone on death row right now, and the law that repealed the death penalty left intact the one death sentence that is currently pending, and that's against Michael Addison, who was convicted of killing a police officer in Manchester, New Hampshire. Michael Addison is a black man, and what I wanted to tell you, and so I think I wasn't privy to the legislative process, but for somehow during the process it was part of the legislation that death sentence would remain intact even with the repeal. So of interest is that while Michael Addison was being prosecuted for that offense, also being prosecuted was a man named John Brooks, who was a wealthy white businessman who hired someone to kill a handyman in Derry, New Hampshire. And they investigated, determined that that's what happened. They prosecuted him. He was convicted of capital murder, a crime in New Hampshire that carries the possibility of a death sentence. But in that case, his jury elected to give him a life in prison sentence. And so in our little New Hampshire, it's a microcosm of what's going on nationwide with death penalty, which is that the statistics are overwhelming in that black defendants facing capital murder charges, capital crimes, are in much greater numbers being sentenced to death than white criminal defendants. And beyond that also, the statistics regarding white or black victims of homicide, when you look at the sentences that flow from those crimes, just looking at who the victim was, you also see this enormous disparity in who's receiving the death penalty. So Jerry Ann wanted me to talk about what's going on in the courts these days. I thought that was a particularly relevant topic, even though I'm not personally involved in the work, but I just have been keeping an eye on it. So anyway, I welcome any questions on any aspect of those thoughts, and I saw a lot of reaction when you heard that I worked for the United Nations for the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, which was the entity that prosecuted former political leaders of the former Yugoslavia for crimes against humanity and war crimes in the former Yugoslavia. It was a very interesting time. And I'm going to hand the microphone to Jordan now. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I'm not sure I'll take the full 10 minutes. But my name is Jordan Thompson. I am 20 years old. I'm from Nashua, New Hampshire. Jerry Ann invited me here today to probably speak about my work with MBK, and I think I'll focus on that because we can talk about a million things. So, of course, My Brother's Keeper was the initiative that began under President Obama's administration in 2012 after the shooting death of Trayvon Martin. And what President Obama set out to do with My Brother's Keeper is to provide access to resources and opportunities for young boys and men of color so they would not fall down a path that would lead them to Trayvon Martin's death. And so some of the work that we've been doing in communities across the nation has really been involved with a number of things. I went out to Oakland, as Jerry Ann said. I was selected out of a wide pool of applicants to attend the summit in Oakland. And of course, hanging out with President Obama was cool, but I was much more inspired by the young boys and men of color there who were doing really incredible work in communities like Sacramento and Chicago and New Orleans and Baltimore, working in their community on educational initiatives, studying financial literacy, and trying to provide access to resources that young people in their communities did not have. I initially got involved with MBK because, well, I'll bring this back to the spring of 2018. I was a candidate for the New Hampshire House of Representatives, but I was also communications director for the Greater Nashua Young Democrats. I've been working for several parts of the Democratic Party over the past couple of years. And one of my responsibilities was to kind of do some community outreach. We wanted to organize events that would bring new faces into our group. And I started to notice that a lot of our event planning was very one-dimensional. I had been someone who had really been involved in racial justice advocacy and organizing. At that point, I was leading workshops on feminist theory, namely intersectionality, and how racial disparities were affecting marginalized people, and how having multiple marginalized identities kind of set you up on a different path of failure in society. And so through that, I'd come to see the world in a different lens. And around this time, there had been another rise in police-related shootings of unarmed Black men and women across the nation. At this point, namely Stephen Clark had just been murdered in California. And I had seen a couple of months before how the shooting deaths in Parkland had launched this national debate about gun control, and how the Parkland kids were going on CNN, and they had been invited to the White House by President Trump, and they had this national platform. And I started to think, I know that there are Black mothers that have been organizing on gun violence for my entire life, and beyond that, why are they not given the same platform? Why are the Black kids that are shutting down highways in Detroit to protest police brutality and gun violence not given the same platform? What is it about these Parkland kids? God bless their souls, they're incredible for everything that they've done, but why is it that they have been given this platform that others do not have? And the answer is very simple, but this happened in a white, affluent community. And so this was something that white Americans could no longer run from. So through that lens, I started to attempt to organize some form of vigil or some sort of remembrance of the victims of police brutality. And I kind of veered away from that because I didn't want to be seen, I'll be very honest about this, I didn't want to be seen as the angry Black man in the room, because I often was that anyway. But I didn't want to be reactionary. So I thought, how can I come up with some kind of event in Nashua that will celebrate Black history, that will allow people who are unfamiliar with Black history to learn something new and translate whatever they learn into their work moving forward. And it was the first week in June, and I remembered Juneteenth. Of course, I can do something with that. And so I organized, with the help of my mayor's office, I organized Nashua's first Juneteenth event. And that was a really incredible event. I was able to do that, to bring this back full circle, I was able to do that with the help of my brother's keeper. And we had a strong showing. People who had never heard of Juneteenth in their lives came out to that event, and they learned a lot. And I still get today people who will tag me in a Facebook post of something Juneteenth related, and they're like, well, I'm so grateful that I learned about this at that event. So as I was running for the State House, I had known that through our legislature, Juneteenth recognition was something that had been attempted in the past, but it hadn't really gone anywhere. At no fault to the organizers, but really at fault of our legislators. But I said, this is something that we need to make happen. We are one of the last states in the entire country that does not acknowledge Juneteenth, the day where, the slaves, the enslaved people in Galveston, they were freed. This is a holiday that people celebrate in other parts of the country, and we are one of 5 states that does not. That is unconscionable. So I partnered up with Senator Melanie LeVake, of course, who is our first Black female state senator. I think that deserves a round of applause. I partnered up with her, and I asked her to speak at the event, and she was one of the co-sponsors of one of the Juneteenth bills that had initially come about in years past with the help of then Senator Martha Fuller Clark. And like I said, unfortunately that didn't go anywhere, but we had the conversation about Juneteenth, and we said, you know, win or lose this election, we are going to make Juneteenth recognition a reality. Around this time as well, I had partnered with the Governor's Council on Diversity and Inclusion, which I had always been a little skeptical of because I don't want to get too political, but I'm not exactly Sunny Newman's biggest fan. So I was a little confused as to why he was even doing the Council on Diversity and Inclusion. I mean, I knew what the official reason was, but anyway, I digress. I had partnered with Rogers Johnson and a few others on that council, and we had, I don't know if any of you went to these, but we had kind of like statewide, I'm not sure, meetings, I guess is the term that you would use to describe them, where people of color and marginalized people from every community would come to those meetings and talk about some of the issues that that they felt were going unsolved, that were going unheard, that were going unnoticed. And the Governor's Council would take those concerns into consideration. They would issue recommendations. After I partnered with that council, one of the recommendations that they made to Governor Sununu was to make the proclamation for Juneteenth recognition, and so he signed that in 2018. But we knew that there was still the legislative fight. We wanted to go about it the right way. We wanted to, because the governor can sign anything any day, and it won't mean anything. But we wanted to make sure that this was something that went through our legislature and that he signed after it had gone through both bodies. And that's what we did. And I really have to, we owe an enormous debt of gratitude to Senator Melanie LeVay, because she was really on the front lines of that, leading in every way possible. Of course, the Black Heritage Trail had a huge part in that as well. Jerry Ann had a huge part in that. So I just really have to thank them. But beyond all of that, she briefly mentioned some of the work I've done with child welfare advocacy. I was a regional coordinator for a nonprofit called the National Foster Youth Institute. We have 2 offices, one in LA and one in DC. And we're really building a movement to transform the child welfare system. I'm a former foster youth, and we have a program every year where we recruit 100 current and former foster youth from around the nation. We put them in workshops, we put them in trainings, and we have them spend a day shadowing their member of Congress to talk policy and to influence legislation. We work really hard on the Families First Act that was signed into law by President Trump in 2018. But this correlates, which I'm sure some of you are probably wondering what does that have to do with anything. But of course, in the foster care system, people of color, LGBTQ+ people, they are overrepresented. And one of the big drives that I made during this last piece was that we really need to have like cultural awareness trainings, because oftentimes, I know when I was in the child welfare system, there were times where I felt at odds with my culture as a Black man in America. I felt like that was ignored. I felt like I had no concept of that. So that's some of the work that we're doing there. Currently, beyond all of that, I just started as an organizer for Senator Kamala Harris's presidential campaign. Very excited about that. But above all, my concern and focus has always been that racial justice advocacy, trying to make it very clear to everyone the correlation between racial justice, economic justice, social justice, and environmental justice, because they're all intertwined. You cannot fight for one and not the other. And so, with all of my work in child welfare reform, with all of my work running for the State House and Juneteenth recognition, and some of the other events that we're attempting to do, we did a really great Black History Month event, and we're going to do one for Indigenous Peoples Day, we're going to do one for Latinx Heritage Month. But that's some of the work that we've been doing with My Brother's Keeper, and I'm really blessed to have that kind of platform with them. So I think I've talked enough.
I always, I love to quote Frederick Douglass. You can do a little, you can do, or you can do a lot. Douglass went on in that speech to say that most people sit around thinking about doing something, that they haven't sent the money. They haven't gone door to door for any politician that they say they love. I love this person, and then they sit at home and do nothing. 92% of the American people have never given a political donation. Did you hear that? So they're sitting around talking about how they love Senator Harris or they love Joe Biden, and they don't send the $5. And now it's easy. They send you a little email, and they ask you for the $3.
Harass you.
Okay? And then after you give it, they ask you for $5. Now, why do I start with that? Because this society would be turned upside down if we all did a little. Seriously. I run a nonprofit. We pay for 500 children to learn to swim every year. And it's the most irritating thing in the world. People who have given $1 at an event go around bragging how they have helped. And I can't say anything to them. You're exaggerating. You're not telling the truth. You're not. And at that event, you bought, Starbucks sponsored it. 300 people came. It was a $1 event. That's all we asked for. And then they turned around and bought $5 worth of coffee from Starbucks at our event. Are you listening? We do this as a society. We really do. And I repeat, in Europe, France, 82% of all people donate to politics.
Wow.
85 to 90% of people vote in primaries in Great Britain. What is wrong with us? Seriously. So every place I go, I give 30 of these speeches a year, Jerry Ann, thank you. Every place I go, I say, will you do a little and do it once a month? On the 30th of each month, I say to myself, what have you done? And there are two ways I check myself. How much money have I given away? And then how much volunteering have I done? And I don't count Stages of Freedom. I don't get paid for it, but I work 6 to 10 hours free every day. But I say, what have I done? And I never go to sleep at night without having done something. 2 things. 1, offered, and 2, do. So before 9 o'clock tonight, I will give a check to somebody. And on days when I don't feel wealthy, it's a $10 check. And there are days when I give a $100 check. And on December 1st, I look and see what I have done. I'm a member of the NAACP of Springfield, Massachusetts, Boston, Massachusetts, Providence, Newport, and Detroit. And it's cheap. Cheap. So I'm going to do 2 things today. One, I'm going to tell you who I'm going to give the check to later today. But every time I see a young person, African American, Native American, Latino, white, whatever, who's out in the world doing something, doing a lot, I give them my card, and I say this to them. I already gave you a card, but I didn't say this to him when I gave him the card. Call on me at any time. Now I have a problem because I have 5,000 children. Seriously. We put them through the swim program, we take 100 kids to the Newport Jazz Festival. Every single one of those kids, now 5,001, I give them my card, and I put them on my email listserv, and twice a year I write to them and say, can I help? It's awful, because sometimes 300 or 400 will respond to the email. But in between those times, maybe 1 kid a week asks for something. Someone just needed bus fare to go to Dartmouth for an interview. And half the time I take it out of my pocket, the other half the time, I know 50 people who went to Dartmouth. I call them up. And I say I have a young man, he's 18, he's Latino, he wants to go up to Dartmouth, he needs bus fare. Can you give me $200? It only cost $100. And gave him the bus fare and $100. And the person I asked was thrilled. He's never been asked before. So I'm going to switch subjects, but every place I go, I say to people, do a little, or a lot. And most people don't have 501 children, but you should have a lot of children. You really should. It's cool. So, and I'm very serious about it. Anytime I can help. So I get nervous when I say that because he's really doing stuff. We had a most interesting facial expression and comment here in the very front seat in the House. Well, kind of the front seat in the House. Slavery, this is the first nation in the world in which slavery is based exclusively on race, and in which, depending on who you believe, 10 million to 20 million people were snatched out of Africa. The majority went to South America and to the Caribbean. And they had to go to the Caribbean because lifespan 7 years. They killed them. They worked them to death in the Caribbean. The heat, the sun, and you do 14 hours in that, and you live 7 years on average. Okay? So they bring them there at 18 and they're dead at 25. Now in the American South, you can do your normal lifespan, and in New England, household servant, you can do your normal lifespan. Up to 20 million people enslaved. Now what comes with this? All kinds of people get rich. In Rhode Island, about 100 families became basically millionaires, owning, selling slaves. Just think about that. And not a one of those Rhode Island families has ever done anything for African Americans. Nothing. Not a one of them has ever set up a fund, Black College Fund. Not a one of them. And one of the families is worth $1 billion. Now the Browns are only worth 400 or 500 million. They think they're poor. And the DeWolfs, #1 slave dealer in America, they've fallen on hard times. They couldn't be worth 40 million between the whole family. Once, a man who was involved in enslaving 200,000 people, #1 slaver in North America. He wouldn't have been a big shot in terms of that title in South America. But up here he was. They've never done anything. Not a dime. This summer, Stages of Freedom has hired a young person to research the 40 families who got rich off of slavery. It's documented. It's not my opinion. And we're going to ask them to give 1% of their liquid wealth to an education fund for African Americans. Now, did you hear this moderation? I hate moderation. 1% of their liquid wealth. They don't have to sell a boat, an extra summer home, nothing. Go up to Fidelity and get 1% of the money they have making interest and put it in an educational fund. And this will be for 5 years old to death. And it will be for summer school, summer camp, automotive, mechanical, learn something, X-ray technician school, or Harvard. And only the interest will be given. And all you have to do is be an African American who lives in Rhode Island or can prove that your family lived in Rhode Island before 1990. Okay? And you, every January, you apply, 1-page form, nothing complicated. Nope. People do that. They ask you to apply, and boom, you can't figure out the paperwork. You just put down, Jimmy's 7, we want to send him to summer school, and it costs $482. And the money will be given if there is enough. And if it's not, it will be given proportionally. So you want to go to Colby College, and it's $14,000, you might only get $2,000 or $3,000. It'll be a new source. So, I will report back, Jerry Ann, and tell you in September how many of the families have decided to cough up. Now, we're not picking on them, and this is not reparations. Did you hear me? I used to be opposed to reparations because of the pushback and the trouble and documentation and all that stuff. I'm now in favor of it, but it ain't going to happen. I'm in favor of many things that aren't going to happen. And the reason this isn't reparations is because almost all those families give to Rhode Island Hospital, give to Brown University, give to Harvard. 11 of those families have Harvard graduates, and I track them, and they give. So this is nothing but scholarship fund that is very broad. That's all it is. Would you please give to an educational fund to enlighten, enhance the lives of African Americans who live in Rhode Island or who did? No research. I don't want to have to find all of their slaves. This is a Georgetown trick. None of that garbage. You have to prove that you were a slave of the duels. 9 out of 10 people can't do it. So I'm sharing this with you because we could change the world if we try. And it's little things that will change people's lives. Let me go back just to slavery just for 2 minutes and then I'll stop because I want to answer your question. So you show up in these stores and you're enslaved and you're mistreated. You have no rights. Your children are enslaved. It's unbelievable. They take your name. They take your religion. They take you away from your mother. Everything you could imagine to lower a person's standing in the world, slavery does. And they do everything to make it keep going. It's only through a war that it ends. It ends. Did you hear that? It. And then 85% of all slaves are sharecroppers. Most of them on the same piece of land where they were a slave. And within 2 years, they're indebted to the plantation owner for seed or whatever, and they cannot leave. It is only after World War II that people leave in droves, quite often running away illegally, because you owe somebody $5,000. And in Georgia, Arkansas, all of them, they'll put you in jail for evading your debt. Then you come to segregated North. But remember, most folks stay in the segregated South. They're just not on the plantation. And they're in a county where, as late as 1964, 85% of black people cannot vote. This is not ancient stuff. This is now. Mr. Biden's in a little trouble for talking about working well with segregationists. The Senate was controlled by Russell, by segregationists. I always tell people there is a master of the Senate. I never go anyplace without suggesting reading. Master of the Senate. It's about Lyndon Johnson and how he tricked the Southern senators who controlled everything to let him be in charge. And he, with the help of Dr. King and others, brought about the civil rights bills. Okay? He doesn't get his credit for it, but he did it.
Martin Luther King kept adding, didn't he? He did.
Well, and so read Taylor Branch's, I'm going to conclude in 1 minute.
I know.
Read Taylor Branch's books on King, the middle one, and you'll see these giants. Now, every place I go, I say, we can't all be giants. Some of us can be little giants, some of us can be whatever. but we can all do a little. So again, let me end by this. Slavery is not over. Racism, discrimination against people of color mainly is not even beginning to be over. I had tears in my eyes. This is my closing remarks to you. I had tears in my eyes the other day watching that black woman abused on television by the police, calling her names because the kid, first I thought it was a dollar store, and someone corrected me, it was a $3 store. The kid stole a doll that she didn't know about, and what they didn't do to her. And they did it because she's black. They would not have done it to a white woman on the planet. But begin with, they probably wouldn't have pursued them over a dollar doll. The standards for prosecuting, humiliating, arresting black people are very low. Thank you for letting me be here today. And remember what Mr. Douglass said. Thank you.
So we're sharing this mic, but thank you for the opening remarks. But does anybody want to know about the courts of the...
Yes.
Yeah. So can you tell us just a little bit so that we can go in a dialogue and compare that to what's going on now?
So in most northern states, and in Arkansas too for some weird reason, they have a day. And sometimes this is festive. And I put the quotes on festive. Rhode Island, and Massachusetts, which I know a lot about, Rhode Island these days lasted for about 27 years. And then someone brought too much to the event. Everybody know what I'm talking about?
Yes.
And we're in the church. So anyway, they brought stuff and it got out of hand. But for 17 years. And this was big stuff because you get elected to be governor of Rhode Island for a day. Now you weren't governor of Rhode Island. You were governor of the picnic ground. And there'd be 200-300 people. At the last one, there were 700 people, and they get the whole day off. Now this is in addition to Christmas and Thanksgiving and sometimes Easter. And again, northern thing. In the South, slaves normally got Christmas off and that's all, so it was a big deal. And this is part of Christianizing people. Now also in a place like, again, we're short on time, but in Rhode Island there's a black man who could adjudicate cases of a small nature. Remember, there is no criminal justice system that's elaborate. There are judges and all that. But if you go back far enough, there's a real problem because they don't have jails or they don't have jailers. And so you really can't jail anybody. You go back to colonial times, you have to send them to England where they're mad and they put them in the cellar and kill them. Basically, it's the death penalty. And that's what Roger Williams avoided. But in almost all of these northern states, there would be a black person or even a council. And they would be able to handle neighborhood disputes. Now, we're supposed to be creating that now in most states in which two neighbors have a fight and you can get it resolved without going to court. Well, this was really quite common, probably to the 1840s, in which time it began to stop. So it's an amazing thing in slavery that we have this. Now, I don't think it's as robust as people put on. I think it's like the Underground Railroad. It's probably a third of what we're told. And again, only in maybe 3 states did it last 100 years. Every place else, they were copying. I believe Connecticut was first, and so they were copying.
So I know in Portsmouth, we did have our Negro courts as well, and we had, so what happened here is that the enslaved were allowed to kind of self-govern around very small infractions. So the owning class would give them this day, and it was election day, and they would select their king, their governor, and their own parliament. And if there's small infractions, they would, among the enslaved people, then they would go to the king and his council and settle the disputes among themselves. So the owning class would think that, you know, for small things, that was okay. It was a way of keeping them, giving a small amount of freedom, but still, you know, keeping that thumb down, because for anything else it would come. And that was, for what I thought in reading up, it was patterned after the community judicial system back in the homeland, you know, where the chief and his council would come together. So small and...
So, Jerry Ann, let me share this with you. So, this is, I had one for New Hampshire, but I couldn't find it. This is Rhode Island, August 12, 1766. 8 people, Prince Thorsten and others, Caesar and Linden, organized a picnic. And at this picnic, it cost $33. And we've done the math. That's about $3,000 for this picnic. About 300 people went. The pig cost $10, and they rented the farm from somebody white, and they paid them $7.40 to rent their farm for the day. And the picnic started at 10 a.m. and ended at 10 p.m., and people had to find their own way home. Here is listed all the food they had, and what isn't listed is that a white woman was hired to do the cooking, so that all 300 black people could have fun.
Yes, I'd like to recommend Black Portsmouth by Valerie Cunningham and Mark Sammons. There's a great deal of detail in that book about the Negro courts and Negro election day right here in Portsmouth. So I recommend that. And I can't resist mentioning one other book, because as I was looking at the song, opening up here, the first line of the second stanza says, "Stony the road we trod, bitter the chastening rod, felt in the days when hope unborn had died, yet with a steady beat." I just finished reading Henry Louis Gates' Stony the Road, about Reconstruction, the rise of Jim Crow and white supremacy. I highly recommend it. Also, of course, a documentary series. Thank you.
Thank you. So we're open up for questions, and we can dialogue around this. What I really would like to look at is systems, this whole notion of self-governing, and where we are totally unable to do anything in our systems. So compare this notion of self-governing to impotence in our system.
So go back to the beginning to Philadelphia and Newport. They create societies to marry each other. Black people create. And this is pre-church. So these are very early, 1810, one of them 1790. And then Boston follows along. So this isn't self-governing. This is doing something for self. And then later, starting, again, Philadelphia and then Providence, we get black churches. And the black churches come out of the white churches because you have to get permission to leave the white church. You can't just go. And from 1720 coming forward, black people go to white churches. So there's very little governance. Remember, black people can't vote. They can't be elected to office. They can't do much of anything governmental until very rare. And in most places, they can't even vote. The black folks won the right to vote in Rhode Island in 1822, and in 1824 they lose it. They get it back because of the Door War in 1844 with help from Frederick Douglass.
I have a comment and then a question regarding what Lauren Greenwald was addressing. Medicaid. It seems to me that I actually believe that all these requirements are being saddled for the Medicaid and food stamp programs because they want to cut these programs deeply and drastically. That's what I think the bottom line is. So my question is regarding the death penalty, which I was thrilled about. What do you think Michael Addison's chances are of not being subjected to death?
Yes.
We'll get closer.
Closer, okay. So it's hard for me, having not worked on that case and not being really extremely familiar with the issues. Michael Addison has gone through a process of appealing his conviction, and I'm not even sure what stage that is in. But in terms of his attorneys challenging the application of the now repealed death penalty to his case, I can't really comment on what the likelihood of him being successful in convincing a court to set aside his death sentence. But I think that any litigation related to that issue could take as much as 5 years. It's going to be, so I apologize that I don't have the background in what's going to go into the legal principles that I know that they will challenge it. I don't know, I'm hopeful that they will be successful, but I can't really be more specific, unfortunately, not being a participant in that case and not really knowing exactly from what angle they're going to challenge the new law that repealed the death penalty yet left his sentence intact. It seems
Ridiculous.
Yes, it seems if the death penalty should be repealed, why on earth would they leave one sentence intact? It doesn't make any sense whether you're in favor of it or against it. If it doesn't belong on the books in New Hampshire law, it doesn't belong for anybody. So I would hope that the courts that will field this issue will take it all very seriously and give his team every opportunity to have some victory along the way with that issue. So that's really all I can say on that.
We've got a couple questions. You and then you.
Okay. Similarly, now that some states are beginning to make marijuana possession legal, what does that do to people who are incarcerated for drug possession?
That's a great question.
And the question, repeat it.
I'll repeat the question. The question was, since many jurisdictions are now decriminalizing marijuana possession, what might that do to people who are currently serving sentences related to some variety of drug possession, I assume particularly marijuana possession? I think that everyone in that situation has the ability to challenge their convictions, and many of the statutes that decriminalized marijuana possession are not retroactive, meaning they apply going forward, they don't specifically apply going backwards. So if you have a conviction for a possession charge, a criminal possession charge on your record, you might be able to petition to have it annulled under state law or under some other initiative. Some of these legislative actions, these are all state-initiated changes in the law, not the federal government still has marijuana possession as a crime, which creates a tension between state and federal governments in terms of prosecuting marijuana possession. But it is my understanding that the majority of these laws are going forward, not going backwards. I'd have to look at each state's law to answer that question more fully, but it's a very good question, and if I were someone who had a conviction for marijuana possession or was incarcerated, I'd immediately be filing a motion that the new law applies to me and my conviction should be vacated and my sentence should be vacated. So that's what I would do with that, if I had a client like that.
So there are a lot of ways to get out of jail. I served on the parole board for 2 years. And the last month that I was there, we had 2 of these, and the feds had passed decriminalization laws, and we let them out. People we would not have let out because we didn't probably have the authority. So, you know, folks who got 4 years for something they really should have got 1 for, they came before the parole board, and because of the federal actions, we let them out. And again, probably should have got 0 at the time, but law's the law, the legislature makes it. So I think there'll be a lot of activity.
My question is, what is the legal system doing, whether it's city, state, or federal, to prosecute these cops who are killing black people, using them for target practice? I mean, now, this gentleman that is trying to get out because of his sentence for killing a cop, and he's on death row. But what are they doing with these cops? Why aren't they putting them on death row? You know, enough is enough.
Well, you know that until very recently, a policeman could do almost anything.
But they're still doing it.
Again, did you hear me earlier say I don't believe in moderation? And I don't, because the actions against people of color have been and are often extreme. But you have to also acknowledge when there is change. When I was a kid in Detroit, cops blow black people's heads off and there's no discussion. And then you get to the point where there's a discussion, but the cop doesn't pay a penalty. And then you get to the point where we're at now, and if you follow it, every other cop loses their job. Now then that's not what would happen to anybody else. And then they have all kinds of protections. The union steps in when it shouldn't. The black prosecutors are frightened to go after them. So I see progress. And I also think, again, I don't want anybody to say Ray Rickman came up there and said all these moderate things. I did not. Cops don't kill people like they used to. They kill somebody once a month that they have no business killing. But they used to kill somebody once a day. And we don't have any memory. When we had crime rate through the ceiling in Gary, Indiana, and Detroit, Michigan, and all those places, the cops would kill anybody they felt like. And if you go back I looked this up the other day, in 1974, Detroit police killed 51 black people, in which the NAACP and others said the person didn't have a weapon, wasn't approaching forward towards the cop, there was no excuse. And they all got away with it. So I would say, again, this is trouble coming out of my mouth. We are moving towards improvement, but it is still too much.
I'm gonna just ask you to hold a second. I want to play something because I think I want us to look at the systems. It's not just one system. It's not just the court system. It's not just the police force. It is a completely across the board system. Has anybody looked at that new documentary about the exonerated 5?
No, but I want to.
Okay, so I'm just going to play a little piece, and then I want the panel to comment on that.
Yeah, that's a new film. Serious.
Some people don't need to look at that.
Serious. They know it. White people gotta look at that. Trump is saying that those 5 kids did it. He's saying that.
She's been reported that she's been dropped by her publisher. What do you have to say about that?
I think it's important that people be held accountable. And that accountability is happening in a way today that did not happen for the Roman 30 years ago. But I think that it would be a tragedy if this story and the telling of it came down to one woman being punished for what she did, because it's not about her. Really not all about her. She is a part of a system that's not broken. It was built to be this way. It was built this way. It was built to oppress, it was built to control, it was built to shape our culture in a specific way that kept some people here and some people here. It was built for profit, it was built for political gain and power. And it is incumbent upon us. It lives off of us, our taxpayer dollars, our votes, the goods that we buy that are made inside of prisons. It lives off of our ignorance, and we can no longer be ignorant. And so the goal of this, okay, Linda Fairstein, okay, Elizabeth Lederer, okay, all of these people on this particular case who need to be held accountable. The real thing that we are all trying to do, all the artists who collaborate with me, she's asking a question, but she knows the answer. Because she wants me to do it because she loves me. Go, Ava, go, Ava. That's what you're doing. Our real goal is to be able to say, go, America. Let's do this. Let's change this. And you can't change what you don't know, so we came together to show you what you may not know. Now that you know, what will you do? How will you change this? That's our goal.
So when she talks about a system that was built from the start till that continues today, what is she talking about? What system was built to create oppression that continues today? Does anybody want to answer that?
Well, I would like on the last question and how it was answered and how it relates to this. What are we doing to, what's going on with police brutality and homicide and the disproportionate impact on people of color? And this speaks to it too. This is a good opportunity for me to speak about my father's research, who is a social psychologist, and he has a whole body of research on implicit bias. And the foundation for separation and discrimination in this country has slowly been, we are working on fixing that, but what still exists are, in everybody's head, including everybody in this room, we all have certain subconscious bias. There's overt bias that's happening blatantly day in, day out. People are being discriminated against because the person exercising the discrimination is doing so by choice. But then there are people who believed them to be non-biased, non-discriminatory, who may still have something inside them that's just an unconscious bias that rears up in situations like a police officer who has a firearm, who encounters someone in the street and immediately reacts negatively without taking in the facts of what's going on. And that's a reaction out of some kind of unconscious bias. So what she's talking about in this clip is being more aware of these things so that we can, that's not only, as Ray was saying, is there some progress in terms of killing of innocent Black people and talking about it and prosecuting those police officers who are executing people in the streets, but there's science that's coming to everybody's household that's educating people, including police departments, on this question of unconscious bias. And it's not just regarding race, it could be regarding age or weight or gender. There are people raised in our culture grow up learning things that they're not even, no one's specifically teaching them. It's just part of the culture that we grow up in. We're bombarded as children with images that have an effect on your unconscious that you act on as adults. And awareness and the science behind it is definitely something that I think will help improve things. There's my father's research. There's a test you can take on the internet. It's called the implicit association test. That's my dad's test. And it's designed to measure unconscious bias. If there was more time, I'd explain sort of how it works. But you can go on, it's a Harvard website. It's called iat.org or something like that. I haven't looked at it lately, but you can go on and take your own test and see if you measure as having a mild preference for whites, having a mild preference for African Americans, or having a strong preference one way or the other, and you'll be surprised. You'll be surprised at what, even in yourselves, who I'm assuming are very open-minded, non-judgmental, non-biased people. You'll see it, and then you're aware of it, and then you act differently, hopefully, going forward.
I'll be with you just one second. Does everybody know the case that the film is representing here? So the movie is talking about, well, we're being asked to call them the Exonerated Five. It's the Central Park case some years ago where 5 young men, all under the age of 16, were accused of raping the Central Park jogger. And so they've been exonerated recently, and well, one of the young men who went to adult prison at the age of 16, and they were all innocent. They did DNA testing, soil testing, all these testing, and nothing matched the 5 men. But the prosecutor still went ahead, even though she knew that the testing proved their innocence and that they couldn't have done it. And she still insists today that they did something. Maybe they didn't rape her, but they were guilty of something. And she can't say what they were guilty of. So this is what this case is all about. Young men, younger than Jordan here, going to adult prison, and one of the most intense adult prison in New York. So we were looking at the system that set this up.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
I wanted to know very quickly, and don't forget, there was a certain businessman from New York State who took out several pages of advertisement asking that they be murdered, that they be put to death for capital punishment, and that man currently occupies the Oval Office. So this really shows you, I think at the root of all of these systems of oppression, if the root is ugly, everything that comes from the root is going to be ugly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't see this as a situation of implicit, it just seems to go in and out, okay, and of implicit bias. I see this as a situation quite different from that. It's a situation of very explicit bias, okay? And that those really are quite different and but harmful. And the explicit bias is that women should not go out alone in the evening. They're risking too much, and they will be at fault if something happens. And the thing most likely to happen is rape. And if it happens, and the women insist on blaming someone other than themselves, then the police will look for someone black, because part of the explicit bias is that black men rape white women. And the truth is the opposite of that on all of these fronts. But this has been very explicit, taught by parents to children. Girls learn all these cautions, excessive cautions, and white people learn all this fear, and so do black people. And the police are taught to act accordingly.
I agree that the Central Park case was a situation of explicit bias, not implicit bias. It seems like a vehicle to talk about implicit bias, but I agree with that that was sort of a conscious choice of what was going on in terms of identifying defendants, etc.
My wife and I, we did watch the documentary, and I encourage everyone to look at it. It's several clips, they're probably an hour or something long. But what amazed me was all through their journey in prison, when they would go up in front of the parole board, etc., where they would want them to say they were guilty. They refused. They refused, and one was like, what, I mean 40 years, where he absolutely said, I did not do that. And he stuck to his belief, what he had done, his truth, and stayed in prison, which absolutely just blew my mind, etc. So it's unbelievable. It starts when they're teens, it goes right up to when they're out of jail, etc. This that type of thing. It's unbelievable.
One of the other things that it showed is how hard it is for the incarcerated person to come back into society and make a living and even exist. So even if you're wrongly convicted, then you're convicted again once you get out.
I just wanted to say something about systems. This country was founded on the principles that white men of property, which they had stolen from the Native Americans, have the right essentially to do what they want. And that exceptionalism, that white exceptionalism, is really the basis of all of this. And most of us don't understand that history. A really great book that I read that talks a lot about this is called Stand Your Ground by a woman named Kelly Brown Douglas. And it really traces that and traces how during the 18th to 19th century, this position was supported by the church and by the legal system and by science, both by science and religion. And that is really, it's in our bones. And we really have to work hard to try to overcome that.
I wanted to share with the gentleman, in 40 states, when you go before the parole board, you have to say, I did it, I'm sorry, and I will not do it again. And you have to say that very clearly. And the reason for it is to protect the parole board members, because if you get out, and if they let you out, and you go do something wrong, the newspaper and the governor will attack them, because in the record, you never said, I did it, I'm sorry, I'll never do it again. So why did you let the person out? This is the most incredible thing. Share this with your father, okay? On the Rhode Island Parole Board, I kept voluminous notes. Only 5% of white people refuse to say those three things. Because if you don't say it, you cannot be let out. You with me? Almost 50% of black men would not say it. They wouldn't say it. And I would call up their lawyers, I didn't talk directly to them, and tell them, keep their pride to themselves, keep their mechanical beliefs to themselves, and get out of jail. But I was just sharing with you, that is the law in 41 or 2 states. And the law is difficult. And it's difficult to maneuver. And then finally, back to race and economics, 40% of all white folks in Rhode Island have a lawyer. About 4% of black people have a lawyer. When they come to the parole board. And you get a lawyer, you've got a much better chance. So economics, which we haven't talked about today, but all of this stuff causes people of color quite often not to have the resources they need to protect themselves in the system.
So there was one line in that film that really got me. When the the lawyer for one of the young men went to her and, he knew that they had this DNA evidence, and he went to her and said, what about the truth? And she said, the truth doesn't matter, it's about politics. Who does that serve?
Now, I'd like to just go back to the Citrus Rock 5 again and that prosecutor. And our criminal justice system is very well named. It is criminal. And the other thing is, Jerry Ann asked a question way back, and especially for white people, and Robert DiAngelo's book, White Fragility, I mean, we need to read that book and take it to heart and act on what she says. But we need to start and just say, you know, the invention of whiteness in Europe over 400 years ago, and then brought to these shores to justify slavery, and all the institutional racism that flows from that, that's where we have to start. And I don't know how many people actually know that. It was actually invented to justify the enslaving effort.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think there are so many institutions that have such terrible roots, going back to that root analogy. I mean, that's, and really going back to what you said earlier, so many people don't know there are so many things in this country that are directly derived from slavery. Like, slaves built the White House, slaves built a majority of Washington, D.C., roads, bridges, like museums. I had the, colleges, and you see just now there are some universities that are finally starting to pay reparations to the descendants of slaves who built those colleges. I even think, not to like invoke Malcolm X here, but I even think like, to my last name is Thompson. It's the last name that has English and Scottish origins. How on earth did I get that last name? I got that last name because way back when, my ancestors were stripped of their culture, their heritage, their real name, and I was given this one. And so I think it goes way deeper than most people even begin to realize. And there are so many institutions and so many examples of systemic oppression, whether it be in housing, whether it be in economics, whether it be in mental health awareness, whether it be in so many issues. And I think we all have to really examine and begin to understand the intersectionality of all of these issues and how they impact each and every one of us.
On that note, thank you very much. Leaving it with the youth for today.